Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. The photograph seems unremarkable at first glance, a sepia-toned memory from 1904, capturing a moment that should represent pure joy. A wedding portrait, formal, posed, and perfectly ordinary for its time. The couple stands before an elaborately painted backdrop of columns and curtains, a common feature in professional photography studios of the Edwardian era. The groom appears confident in his dark suit, hair neatly parted, his mustache precisely trimmed according to the fashion of the day. His posture is stiff yet proud, hands clasped before him as was customary in portraits of the period. His expression carries the appropriate solemnity for such an occasion, a hint of a smile but nothing undignified. And then there is the bride. Her gown is exquisite, layered with delicate lace, cinched tightly at the waist. Pearl buttons trail up to her throat, where a cameo brooch rests against her collar. Her hair is swept up elegantly beneath a veil that cascades down her back. At first you might think nothing seems amiss, but it's her eyes that betray the image's facade of matrimonial bliss. While her body is turned slightly toward her new husband, her gaze is fixed elsewhere. She is looking past the photographer, beyond the camera, focused intently on someone or something else in the room. There's an intensity in her expression, not the shy demureness one would expect of a bride in 1904, but something more complex, longing perhaps, or fear. Who stands there, just outside the frame? What presence commands her attention so completely that even in this permanent record of her wedding day, she cannot bring herself to look at either her husband or the camera? According to the handwritten note on the back of the photograph, the couple was Elizabeth and Thomas Harrington of Millfield. They were married on the 22nd of June, 1904, at St. Mary's Church. The photographer's stamp indicates the portrait was taken at Wentworth Studio, a prestigious establishment that served the upper middle class of the region. The photograph was discovered in the attic of a home in Millfield that had belonged to the same family for generations. It was tucked inside a leather-bound Bible, alongside pressed flowers and a lock of dark hair tied with faded ribbon. What makes this image particularly disturbing is not just the bride's diverted gaze, but what records tell us happened after. The marriage of Elizabeth and Thomas Harrington lasted precisely 3 months and 4 days. By autumn, Elizabeth had vanished without explanation. Thomas claimed his bride had abandoned him, returning to her family in a neighboring town. But Elizabeth's family insisted they had not seen her. No investigation was ever formally conducted. Within a year, Thomas had moved away from Millfield, selling their home and taking with him all traces of their brief union. All traces except this photograph, this single moment captured in time, where Elizabeth's eyes tell a story her lips never could. A story that begins with a question. Who stood behind that camera, holding her gaze on what should have been the happiest day of her life? Local archives yielded fragments of the past when I researched the Harrington mystery further. Millfield in 1904 was a town divided by the new wealth of industrialization. The Harringtons belonged to that ambitious merchant class, Thomas having inherited his father's successful timber business, which supplied the expanding railway. Elizabeth, however, came from more modest circumstances, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. Wentworth Studio's ledger, preserved in the County Historical Society, revealed an intriguing detail. The wedding portrait sitting was paid for not by Thomas Harrington, but by a J. Sinclair. Further investigation identified him as James Sinclair, 32 years old at the time, the photographer's assistant. His name appears frequently in the studio's records, but mysteriously vanishes from all local documentation shortly after Elizabeth's disappearance. I located Thomas Harrington's death certificate from 1938. He never remarried and died in a sanitarium 3 counties away. The attending physician noted chronic melancholia as a contributing factor. Among his personal effects was listed a single item of jewelry, a woman's cameo brooch. Most telling was the discovery of church records indicating Elizabeth had been seen regularly at early morning services in the months before her wedding, often in tearful prayer. The parish diary, kept by Father Morrison, includes a cryptic entry dated June 20th, just 2 days before the wedding. Miss Wells, Elizabeth's maiden name, came in great distress, advised patience and prayer. Some matters cannot be interfered with when families have decided. The wedding itself was sparsely attended. According to the Society column in the Millfield Herald, the absence of Elizabeth's 3 sisters was noted as curious, though attributed to a convenient case of spring fever. At the county records office, I found the deed transfer for the Harrington home, sold in February 1905 to a Martin Blackwell. The transaction was handled entirely through solicitors, with Thomas never appearing in person. Neighbors interviewed decades later for a town history recalled moving vans arriving at night, and Thomas departing before dawn. Perhaps most disturbing was what I found beneath the floorboards of what had been the Harrington bedroom when the house underwent renovation in 1972. A small lady's boot with the initials EW stitched inside the leather, and beside it, a tarnished photographer's flashpan. The current owners of the house report occasional unexplained occurrences: footsteps on the stairs when no one is there, a pervading chill in the former bedroom that defies modern heating, and most commonly, the lingering scent of lilies, Elizabeth's bridal flower, even in deepest winter. What connects these scattered pieces? The frightened bride, the photographer's assistant who paid for her portrait, the abandoned boot, and a groom who spent his remaining years in an institution, clutching a cameo brooch. The photograph itself offers one final clue. Just visible in the mirror behind the couple is the partial reflection of another figure, cropped at the edge of the frame, a man's hand resting on what appears to be a camera. I visited Wentworth Studio, now a craft boutique, its history preserved only in the faded sign above the door. The current owner allowed me access to the building's basement, where decades of forgotten equipment gathered dust. Among the discarded tripods and chemical bottles, I discovered a small wooden box containing glass plate negatives, miraculously intact. Most depicted weddings from the era, solemn brides and grooms arranged in identical poses before the same painted backdrop. But one negative stood out. It was Elizabeth and Thomas's wedding portrait, the full, uncropped version. The negative revealed what the print had concealed. James Sinclair stood partially visible at the edge of the frame, his hand indeed resting on a camera, not the main camera capturing the portrait, but a smaller one positioned at an angle. More disturbing was Elizabeth's left hand, tightly gripped within Thomas's own. Even through the negative's inverse shadows, one could discern his whitened knuckles, the forceful curl of his fingers around her wrist. Elizabeth Wells had been engaged briefly to James Sinclair in 1903, according to a small announcement in the Millfield Herald Society pages from April that year. The engagement notice was followed 3 weeks later by another announcement. Elizabeth Wells to wed Thomas Harrington, son of prominent businessman Edward Harrington. The local medical examiner's logbook from that period, stored in the county archives, contained an entry dated September 26, 1904, exactly when Elizabeth vanished. It noted an unidentified female body discovered in Millfield Creek, too decomposed for proper identification. The body was buried in an unmarked grave after minimal investigation. The creek, I learned, ran directly behind Wentworth Studio. I traced James Sinclair to a small town in Nova Scotia, where he had established a photography business in early 1905. Correspondence in the Historical Society there included letters between Sinclair and a Miss E, spanning several years. The letters abruptly ended in 1907. Among Thomas Harrington's possessions catalogued upon his institutionalization was a locked box containing newspaper clippings about photographers who had met violent ends across New England and Canada. The final clipping, dated August 1907, detailed the mysterious drowning of Nova Scotia photographer James Sinclair. When I returned to the Harrington house one final time, the owners permitted me to examine the attic thoroughly. Behind a false wall, we discovered a photography developing area with chemicals long dried to powder. Scratched into the wooden countertop was a message: "She looks always to me." Most revealing was the parish registry I finally gained access to through Father Morrison's great-nephew. An entry from June 19, 1904, recorded Elizabeth Wells's desperate confession: she was with child. The father's name was partially obscured by water damage, showing only J. Sin. It was not uncommon in that era for a family to arrange a hasty marriage to avoid scandal. Edward Harrington's timber business had been failing. Thomas had much to gain from aligning with even a modest family like the Wells, who owned land adjacent to valuable forest. The photograph captures not just a bride looking past the camera, but a moment suspended between three lives, one that would end in an unmarked grave, one in an asylum, and one in exile. Elizabeth's eyes, fixed on James Sinclair, tell us everything her voice never could, a truth that Thomas Harrington couldn't allow to survive. I returned to St. Mary's Church, now rarely used except for occasional services. The elderly caretaker granted me access to the church's archive room after I explained my research into the Harrington case. Amid stacks of moldering prayer books and parish records, I discovered a small leather diary belonging to Father Morrison, different from the official parish diary previously consulted. The personal entries painted a darker picture of the events surrounding Elizabeth and Thomas's wedding. Father Morrison had written on June 21, 1904, "I fear I have failed this child. E.W. came again today, bruises visible at her wrists. She begs for intervention that I cannot provide." The elder Harrington's influence extends even to the bishop. When she mentioned fleeing with S, I cautioned her about the dangers. T.H. is not a man who forgives. In the margins of the wedding ceremony page, the priest had made a troubling notation. Bride attended by Harrington's man Fisher. No family present. Her eyes sought the gallery throughout. I saw Thomas strike her hand when she hesitated with the vows. This Fisher appeared in no official wedding records, but town employment ledgers identified him as Cyrus Fisher, formerly employed by Edward Harrington's timber operation as security. Police reports from neighboring towns connected him to several violent incidents against labor organizers. At the County Historical Society, I found a collection of Wentworth studio photographs recently donated by a descendant of the original owner. Among them was a group portrait of the studio staff from June 1904. James Sinclair stood at the back, his expression solemn. The photograph was dated one day after Elizabeth's wedding. Most chilling was my discovery at the old Millfield Cemetery. The section for unclaimed bodies had been relocated during a highway expansion in 1960. During the exhumation process, one unmarked grave, the one corresponding to the September 1904 date, had contained unexpected items. A tarnished cameo brooch matching the one in Elizabeth's wedding portrait, and a glass negative wrapped in waxed paper. The cemetery administrator had placed these items in storage, where they remained forgotten until my inquiry. The negative, when I had it carefully developed, showed Elizabeth alone in her wedding dress, smiling genuinely, a stark contrast to her expression in the official portrait, written on the paper wrapper in faded ink, "My true bride, J.S." I consulted a forensic anthropologist about the remains from the unmarked grave. Though limited by the documentation available, she noted the coroner's original measurements indicated the deceased was approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, significantly taller than Elizabeth's 5 feet 2 inches recorded on her marriage license. The final piece emerged when I interviewed Thomas Harrington's former sanitarium nurse, now 96 years old but sharp of mind. She recalled him muttering the same phrase repeatedly in his final days. 2 in the creek, not 1. Elizabeth's gaze in that wedding portrait, looking beyond the camera, wasn't merely yearning for James Sinclair. It was witnessing something terrible unfolding, something that would lead to her disappearance, James's flight to Nova Scotia, and eventually, his suspicious drowning. The truth seemed increasingly clear. Elizabeth had been looking at someone orchestrating the doom of all 3 people captured by that camera. I traced the thread connecting Thomas Harrington's final words to a property record I nearly overlooked. The Harrington Timber Company owned a small cabin near Millfield Creek, never mentioned in any previous documentation about Elizabeth's disappearance. The structure still stood, abandoned and reclaimed by Forrest, yet legally owned by a shell company I traced back to Edward Harrington's business interests. With permission from local authorities, I explored the dilapidated cabin. Decades of neglect had collapsed portions of the roof, allowing saplings to grow through rotted floorboards. In what remained of a small root cellar, preserved from moisture by a quirk of drainage, I discovered a metal box containing ledgers, not business accounts, but personal records kept by Cyrus Fisher. The entries were methodical, detailing services rendered to the Harrington family. Most disturbing was the entry from September 25, 1904. Matter resolved at Creek. T.H. witnessed. 2 problems eliminated. Payment received. This aligned with a bank record showing Thomas Harrington withdrawing a substantial sum the following day, money that never appeared in any business transaction. I consulted newspaper archives again, searching specifically for any mentions of James Sinclair in Millfield after the wedding. A small item noted he had been scheduled to photograph the Harvest Festival on September 24th but failed to appear. The studio owner reported him missing the next day. Elizabeth's family Bible, which I finally located in the possession of a distant cousin, contained a pressed forget-me-not marking the page of Psalm 51. a prayer for cleansing from sin. Tucked within was a letter written in Elizabeth's hand, but never sent, dated September 24th. My dearest Jay, I can delay no longer. What T threatened has come to pass. He knows about the child and says he will see us both destroyed before allowing the family disgrace. Meet me tonight at our place by the creek. We must leave immediately. I have taken what little I could without raising suspicion. The stream where two bodies were supposedly disposed of had changed course over the decades. Working with a university geology department, we identified its original path and secured permission for limited excavation. In what would have been a deep pool in 1904, beneath layers of silt and stone, we recovered fragments of a photographer's camera and a man's pocket watch engraved with the initials JS, but no second body was ever found. Thomas's institutionalization occurred after he began claiming his wife visited him nightly, standing silently by his bed with water streaming from her clothes. His doctor noted his terror of reflective surfaces and his insistence that she watches me from every mirror. Edward Harrington's personal papers, sealed until 50 years after his death and only recently accessible, revealed a letter to Thomas dated October 19, 104. The matter is settled. Fisher has ensured there will be no further complications. Your unfortunate marriage is behind us. The girl and her paramour are gone. You must now compose yourself and remember your position. There are always witnesses, even when we believe ourselves unobserved. The wedding photograph continues to unsettle viewers, not merely because of Elizabeth's diverted gaze, but because of what it captured. A moment when three fates converged, witnessed by the unblinking eye of a camera. Her eyes weren't just looking at someone, they were seeing the architect of a tragedy about to unfold. The photograph called me back one final time. After presenting my findings to the local historical society, I received an unexpected telephone call from a woman named Harriet Fisher, claiming to be the granddaughter of Cyrus Fisher. She had discovered an old steamer trunk while clearing her deceased father's home, a trunk that had belonged to her grandfather. We met at a quiet cafe in Millfield. Harriet was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and direct. She placed a weathered leather portfolio on the table between us without ceremony. "I want nothing to do with what's in here," she said. "My grandfather was not a good man. My father never spoke of him except when drinking, and then only with shame." Inside the portfolio were documents that filled crucial gaps in the Harrington tragedy. Most significant was a series of letters between Edward Harrington and a doctor at a private women's hospital in Vermont. The correspondence detailed arrangements for a patient to be admitted under a false name in October 1904. A patient described as suffering delusions and violent tendencies following the loss of her immoral attachment. Patient logs from the institution, photocopied and included in the portfolio, recorded the admission of an Ellen Harrison, who arrived unconscious and remained sedated for several weeks. Notes described her as with child upon arrival, but relieved of her burden through surgical intervention in November. The patient was subsequently kept in isolation, treated with ice baths and restraints when she became hysterical about her missing photographer. Most disturbing was a signed affidavit from Cyrus Fisher confessing to the murder of James Sinclair and to the abduction, but not murder, of Elizabeth Wells Harrington. The document had never been filed with any authority, seeming instead to serve as insurance against any betrayal by the Harringtons. I delivered the woman as instructed to Dr. Kavanaugh's facility. Fisher had written, "She is to remain there indefinitely as arranged." The photographer's body was weighted and sunk where specified. Thomas Harrington witnessed both actions as his father required. A substitute body from the medical college was placed in the creek to be discovered, wearing the woman's garments. Harriet also provided a small leather-bound book, her grandfather's personal journal. The final entry, dated May 19, 129, read, "Thomas Harrington continues his monthly payments despite his deteriorating mind. His fear sustains my retirement. Edward's death has passed the secret to me alone." The woman remains where she was placed, forgotten by all but the increasingly deranged Thomas, who insists she walks the halls of his room each night. The Vermont institution had closed in 1952. Its records were allegedly destroyed in a fire, but Harriet had one final document, a patient transfer form dated 1951. Elizabeth Wells Harrington, by then using the institution's name for her, Ellen Harrison, had been moved to another facility in western Massachusetts. If she had survived, she would have been in her 70s by then. The wedding portrait now revealed its final truth. Elizabeth wasn't simply looking at James Sinclair behind the camera. She was looking toward a future she somehow sensed, one where she would spend decades imprisoned, her child taken, her lover murdered, all orchestrated by the family whose name she had been forced to take. The Massachusetts State Hospital archives proved difficult to access, protected by privacy laws and bureaucratic indifference. After weeks of persistence, I secured an appointment with the facility's retired administrative manager, Dr. Eleanor Winters, who had overseen record digitization in the 1990s. "Patient 736, she said, tapping the transfer document I'd obtained from Harriet Fisher. "I remember this case because of its unusual longevity. Most patients from that era remained institutionalized because they truly needed care or had nowhere else to go. This woman's file contained annual renewal authorizations signed by a law firm representing a trust. Dr. Winters led me through stacks of microfilm boxes until she located what she sought. The grainy images revealed decades of clinical observations of Ellen Harrison. Early entries described a patient who alternated between catatonia and episodes of violent insistence on her true identity. By the 1960s, notes indicated a woman who had become docile, speaking rarely except to occasionally ask about a child. Most striking was the photograph attached to her file from 1972, Elizabeth at approximately 90 years old. Her face had thinned dramatically, her hair had whitened, but her eyes remained unmistakable. The same eyes that had looked past the camera on her wedding day, now staring directly into it with unsettling clarity. She was released in 1973, Dr. Winters explained. Medicare changes made the trust's arrangement untenable. According to the discharge notes, she was collected by her grandson, though no name was recorded. I traced the law firm that had managed Elizabeth's confinement to a modern practice that had acquired its predecessor's records. A paralegal, sympathetic to my research, discreetly confirmed the trust had been established by Edward Harrington, with provisions for it to continue long after his death. The trust dissolved in 1973, its remaining assets transferred to a recipient identified only as Wells Sinclair. This led me to vital records in a small coastal Maine town, where an Ellen Wells Sinclair died in 1979. Her death certificate listed her age as 97 and her occupation as photographer. The local library maintained a collection of her work, stark black and white portraits taken in her final years, each featuring subjects whose eyes were deliberately blurred or obscured, while their hands remained in sharp focus. The collection's curator shared that Ellen rarely spoke about her past, except to mention she had once been erased from her own photograph. Most revealing was a package addressed to the Millfield Historical Society that had never been delivered, discovered among Ellen's possessions after her death. Inside was a single silver print created from the glass negative of her wedding portrait, chemically altered to reveal what appeared to be a message scratched into the original plate but invisible in standard prints. Across the backdrop curtain behind the couple, barely discernible words read, "Thomas knows what waits beneath." I returned once more to the site where James Sinclair's watch had been discovered. With advanced ground-penetrating radar, technicians identified anomalies 6 feet below where the stream had once flowed. Not human remains, but a waterproof photographer's case containing dozens of glass negatives. The developed negatives from the photographer's case revealed what truly happened beside Millfield Creek on that September evening in 1904. James Sinclair, ever the photographer, had set up a camera with a timer, perhaps intending to capture his reunion with Elizabeth before their planned escape. Instead, it documented the arrival of Thomas Harrington and Cyrus Fisher. The sequential images, remarkably preserved in their watertight case, told a silent story. Elizabeth arriving alone, looking anxiously over her shoulder, James embracing her moments later, then Thomas and Fisher appearing from the trees. The final exposures showed a violent struggle, Fisher restraining Elizabeth while Thomas confronted James at the water's edge. The last negative captured Thomas standing over James's body, Elizabeth being dragged away, her mouth open in what must have been a scream. But the most revealing discovery wasn't among the negatives. At the bottom of the case lay a small diary bound in faded red leather. The handwriting inside belonged to Elizabeth, documenting the weeks between her wedding and planned escape. Her entries revealed Thomas had never consummated their marriage, instead subjecting her to psychological torment, threatening harm to James and her family if she didn't play her role convincingly. "He watches me always," she wrote on August 12th, standing outside my door at night. "When I weep, he tells me I should be grateful, that other men would not be so patient with a wife carrying another man's child. He says when the baby comes, it will disappear, and no one will believe me if I speak of it. The diary's final entry, dated September 24th. Tonight I will meet Jay at our place. T has gone to his father's estate for the weekend. By morning, we will be on a train bound for Montreal. Jay says he can sell his photographs there, and I can have our child in peace. I leave behind everything but the small inheritance from grandmother. Should anyone ever find these words, I was Elizabeth Wells. I loved James Sinclair, and our child deserves to know the truth. Elizabeth never expected Thomas would follow her that night, having established his alibi at his father's home, only to double back with Cyrus Fisher in tow. The Maine town librarian who had known Ellen Wells Sinclair in her final years shared one last detail that completed the puzzle. Among Ellen's few possessions had been a photograph of a middle-aged man who visited her occasionally, a man she introduced only as "my son." He had arranged her cottage by the sea and supplied her with cameras and darkroom equipment after her release from the institution. Town records identified him as William Wells, born in the Vermont Women's Hospital in November 1904, not deceased as Cyrus Fisher had claimed in his confession, but secretly adopted by Elizabeth's youngest sister Catherine, who had moved to Philadelphia shortly after Elizabeth's disappearance. The wedding photograph that started this investigation captured more than a bride looking past the camera. It documented a moment of silent defiance, Elizabeth's eyes connecting with James Sinclair, affirming their secret plan even as she stood beside the man who would orchestrate their destruction. What neither Elizabeth nor James could have known was that their child would survive, and eventually help his mother outlive her captors. The final glass negative from the creek bed remains the most haunting, not for what it shows, but for what lies beyond its edge. While the sequence captures Thomas standing over James's fallen form, the exposure was long enough to record a blurred figure watching from the tree line, a figure whose height and build match Cyrus Fisher, yet whose face appears unnaturally distorted, as though the emulsion itself rejected capturing his features. I consulted an imaging specialist at the university, who confirmed the anomaly wasn't a processing error. The distortion appears deliberate, she explained, as if someone scratched the negative specifically to obscure this person's identity. When I mentioned this matched Ellen Wells Sinclair's own photographic technique of blurring faces in her later work, the specialist grew quiet, examining the images more closely before whispering, she wasn't blurring them. She was removing their power to watch. The town records of Elizabeth's release led me to a retirement community in coastal Maine, where I found Nurse Martha Collins, now in her 90s, who had helped process Elizabeth's discharge in 1973. Her hands trembled as she examined the wedding photograph. That poor woman, she murmured. For nearly 20 years, she refused to look directly at any staff member, always kept her eyes downcast or focused just past our shoulders. The doctors called it paranoid avoidance, but on her last day when her grandson came, she looked him straight in the eyes and said, "They can't see through yours." Elizabeth's final photographs, those stark portraits with deliberately obscured eyes, now revealed themselves not as artistic choice but as protective ritual. In her patient records, Dr. Winters had overlooked a seemingly trivial note in 1961. Patient requests that all reflective surfaces be removed from her room. States, they are still watching through the glass. The Maine cottage where Ellen Wells Sinclair spent her final years has remained unoccupied since her death. Local residents describe it as feeling watched. The realtor who occasionally shows the property mentioned that mirrors frequently crack without explanation. Most disturbing is what happens to photographs taken inside the house. In every image, regardless of camera or photographer, a dark figure appears standing behind the subject, its features indistinct, except for eyes that seem to follow the viewer. William Wells, Elizabeth and James's son rescued from institutional birth, left no direct descendants. His obituary from 1994 mentions only his career as a glassmaker, specializing in non-reflective surfaces. His workshop, preserved as part of a crafts museum, contains notebooks filled with chemical formulas for treating glass to prevent unwanted observation. The original wedding portrait has been moved to climate-controlled storage at the County Historical Society after 3 separate incidents where the glass covering the photograph shattered inexplicably. The curator reports that even without its protective covering, visitors often complain of feeling watched when standing before it. Perhaps most unsettling is what happened when I placed the wedding photograph and the final Creekside negative side by side for comparison. Under ultraviolet light, previously invisible fingerprints appeared on both, modern prints that matched none of the researchers or archivists who had handled them. When analyzed, they were found to contain traces of silver nitrate and developing chemicals not manufactured since 1904. The wedding portrait now hangs in the Millfield Historical Society's Special Collection Room, encased in non-reflective glass, developed through a proprietary technique created by William Wells's company. Even with this precaution, the Society's director reports that the temperature around the photograph drops noticeably every 22nd of June, the anniversary of Thomas and Elizabeth's wedding. I've continued corresponding with Harriet Fisher, who recently discovered additional items within her grandfather's possessions. Most significant was a pocket watch that had belonged to Cyrus Fisher, its case warped as though exposed to intense heat on one side. The watch had stopped at 9:17, the precise time James Sinclair's camera captured the confrontation at Millfield Creek. The watch contained a hidden compartment behind the movement, revealing a scrap of paper with a curious symbol drawn in what appears to be dried blood. When I consulted an anthropologist specializing in folk rituals, she identified it as an obscure protective sigil once used in certain New England communities to ward off what locals called the Watching Ones. The practice supposedly originated among timber workers who believed malevolent spirits inhabited certain ancient trees that would have been harvested by the Harrington Timber Company. Edward Harrington's business ledgers, now fully cataloged, reveal substantial payments to individuals described only as special consultants in the months before Elizabeth's wedding. One such consultant, identified by initial and last name as M. Thornfield, also appears in correspondence with the Vermont institution where Elizabeth was later confined. Thornfield's services apparently included rituals of observation and containment for patients who exhibited sensitivity to the unseen. The curator at St. Mary's Church discovered a hidden panel behind the altar during recent renovations. Inside was a tin box containing Father Morrison's most private writings, separate from both his official parish diary and personal journal. These fragmentary notes describe his growing concern about Thomas Harrington's family. The timber they harvest comes from the old forest where none should cut. The Harringtons have grown wealthy by taking what does not belong to them. I fear what follows them from those woods has attached itself to young Thomas. When Elizabeth stands before me for confession, she speaks of eyes watching from every wood-paneled wall of her new home. I dismissed it as bridal nerves until I visited to bless their house. I felt them too, watching, waiting. The forest does not forgive. Most chilling was my interview with Millfield's oldest resident, Martha Wentworth, great-granddaughter of the photography studio's founder. Now 104 years old, she recalled stories passed down through her family about the actual wedding ceremony of Thomas and Elizabeth. Grandfather never spoke of it willingly, but when the thunderstorms came and the house creaked, he would whisper about that day. He said when Elizabeth walked down the aisle, every wooden pew in St. Mary's groaned and shifted, though no breeze stirred the air. During the vows, the timber beams overhead wept sap that fell like tears. The Harringtons had taken too much from the ancient woods, you see, and the woods had come to witness what they would take next. The stories converge around one unsettling possibility. What if Elizabeth wasn't looking at James Sinclair in that wedding portrait? What if she was looking at something that had followed the Harringtons from the woods they harvested? Something that recognized in her a potential victim, or perhaps more disturbingly, an ally in its patient vengeance. The deeper I followed the threads of Elizabeth's story, the more I felt something following me. Not metaphorically, something tangible that caused the hairs on my neck to rise when I reviewed my evidence late at night. Photographs taken during my investigation began showing anomalies, dark distortions gathering in wooden door frames, window casings, and furniture edges. I consulted a dendrochronologist about the Harrington timber operation, bringing along a sample of wood from the cabin near Millfield Creek. Her examination revealed something extraordinary. "This isn't just old-growth forest," she explained, studying the sample under magnification. "These growth rings display a pattern I've only seen in specimens from a single location, a grove that once stood about 20 miles north of Millfield. Native traditions marked it as forbidden ground. Most of those trees were at least 500 years old when harvested. Town records showed the Harringtons had purchased that precise tract in 1897, clear-cutting it entirely by 1903, just before Thomas's marriage to Elizabeth. In the university archives, I discovered an ethnographer's field notes from 1878 describing local woodsmen's beliefs. They say these ancient trees contain watchers who guard the forest. To fell such trees is to blind the watchers temporarily, but they transfer their sight to human-made objects crafted from their wood, furniture, paneling, picture frames. Those who profit most are watched most closely, awaiting the moment of judgment. I located the inventory of the Harringtons' wedding gifts, finding an item that had escaped my notice. Bedroom suite in walnut, family timber, wedding gift from Edward Harrington. The furniture had been crafted from trees on that forbidden tract. Elizabeth's diary revealed another overlooked entry. The wardrobe watches me at night. T says I am hysterical, but I see eyes in the grain when darkness falls. Last evening, the wood seemed to shift, reaching toward me until T entered the room. Then all was still again. Modern analysis of Ellen Wells Sinclair's photographic chemicals, preserved in her Maine cottage, revealed unexpected compounds, extracts of moss and bark, consistent with old folk remedies used to blind unwanted observers. The solution she applied to blur her subject's eyes contained similar elements to those used by certain indigenous healers to ward off forest spirits. When I examined the negative from Elizabeth's wedding portrait under spectral analysis, I discovered a second exposure layered beneath the visible image. This ghost impression showed the same scene, but Elizabeth's gaze wasn't directed behind the camera. It focused directly on Thomas, whose face appeared twisted almost beyond recognition, the wood grain in the backdrop seeming to flow into his features. Perhaps most disturbing was the recent statement from the retirement community where Nurse Collins resided. She had been found deceased in her room, surrounded by dozens of hand-drawn eyes on scraps of paper. The medical examiner noted unusual splinter patterns embedded in her fingertips, identified as old-growth walnut, though no wooden furniture existed in her room. The forest's patient vengeance stretches across time. What watched Elizabeth from the wooden paneling of her marital home, what followed Thomas to his sanitarium, what looked out from the frames of every mirror, it continues watching still, perhaps through this very photograph, and now, I fear, through me. I've begun receiving letters postmarked from Millfield, though I haven't visited in months. Each contains a slip of paper with a fragment of handwritten text that matches Elizabeth's diary entries, but these passages appear nowhere in the documents I've collected. Yesterday's letter contained a pressed forget-me-not, and these words, "The trees have patience we cannot comprehend." Last week I interviewed the craftsman who created the non-reflective glass now protecting Elizabeth's wedding portrait. He revealed that William Wells had specified a unique requirement. The glass must contain pulverized ash from a specific stand of trees outside Millfield. He was insistent that only this could truly prevent what he called the looking through, the craftsman explained. I've traced the property records of every location connected to this story. The Harrington home, the Wentworth studio, the cabin by the creek, and even St. Mary's Church, all contain structural elements sourced from the same forbidden grove. More disturbing, each building has experienced at least one catastrophic fire in the decades since 1904, except for the church, whose wooden beams were replaced during renovation in 1962. Elizabeth's final photographs from Maine contain another element I initially missed. While the subject's eyes are deliberately obscured, the backgrounds of each portrait include some object made of wood, a picture frame, a chair, a doorway. Each wooden element shows subtle manipulation of the negative to accentuate the natural patterns of the grain, creating shapes that resemble watchful eyes. The curator at the Historical Society called yesterday distressed. The wedding portrait had to be moved to a windowless storage room after visitors reported seeing movement within the photograph, not of Elizabeth or Thomas, but of the wooden backdrop behind them. When they looked directly at it, the movement ceased. I've developed a curious sensitivity when handling documents related to this case. My fingers detect minute variations in old paper, leading me to discover a hidden pocket in the binding of Father Morrison's diary. Inside was a scrap of bark with an inscription in faded ink. What is taken from the watchers will be reclaimed through watchfulness. Thomas Harrington's sanitarium records, which I've finally obtained in full, include an attending physician's note from 1937. Patient insists on sleeping on the floor, refusing to use his wooden bed frame. Claims they are gathering in the wood, waiting for me to lower my guard. Most concerning is the pattern of splinters found in his eyes during this morning's examination, though no source of such splinters exists in his room. Most revealing is what I discovered about Elizabeth's three sisters, whose absence from the wedding was noted in the society pages. town death records show all three died within a decade of Elizabeth's disappearance, each from rare ocular infections that reportedly turned their eyes as hard and patterned as wood knots. Their descendant, who provided this information, added, "Family legend says they could see things others couldn't after visiting Elizabeth's home once after her marriage. I sometimes wake at night feeling watched. Yesterday, I found a perfect circle of forget-me-nots on my doorstep. My wooden desk, an antique purchased in Millfield, creaks at night though my apartment is still. And sometimes, when I review my notes by lamplight, I see in my peripheral vision what appears to be Elizabeth standing in the corner, her eyes no longer looking past the camera, but directly at me. The custodian of the Millfield Historical Society called me in a panic yesterday. The non-reflective glass covering Elizabeth's wedding portrait had developed hairline fractures overnight, forming a distinct pattern. Upon arrival, I found what appeared to be words etched across the protective surface. "The watching never ends." When I placed my audio recorder near the photograph to document this phenomenon, the playback revealed something the human ear hadn't detected: a soft, rhythmic creaking like wood settling in an old house. Sound analysis identified it as matching the specific acoustic signature of walnut from old-growth forests. I've begun tracing the provenance of all wooden items removed from the Harrington home after Thomas's institutionalization. Auction records showed dozens of furniture pieces scattered across New England, sold to unsuspecting buyers. Each location corresponds with subsequent reports of unexplained phenomena, most commonly the sensation of being observed when alone. The university's forestry department granted me access to their collection of timber samples dating back to the 19th century. Among them was a core sample from the Forbidden Grove, taken before the Harringtons clear-cut it. Under microscopic examination, the growth rings contain unusual patterns that, when mapped, correspond precisely to the layout of Millfield as it existed in 1904. The central ring aligns with the exact location of St. Mary's Church. Father Morrison's hidden writings include a conversation with an indigenous elder who warned him about the grove. These trees do not merely grow, they watch and remember. The oldest ones have seen beyond your counting of years. They communicate through root and soil. When men come with saws and axes, the watchers do not die. They relocate. Elizabeth's unusual sensitivity might explain why the watching affected her so profoundly. Her family records indicate her grandmother was known locally as a forest talker, someone believed capable of communicating with the spirits of ancient trees. This knowledge, passed through maternal bloodlines, would have made Elizabeth acutely aware of the displaced watchers gathering in the wooden elements of her marital home. A photograph taken of me during my most recent visit to Millfield arrived in today's mail. Sender unknown. In it, I stand before the Historical Society building, but the windows behind me show not the interior of the building, but what appears to be a dense forest. More unsettling is the branch-like pattern spreading across my jacket where my hand touches the wooden doorframe. I consulted Dr. Eleanor Winters again about Elizabeth's medical records. She located additional notes indicating Elizabeth was initially treated with a now discontinued approach. Patients were placed in rooms paneled entirely in wood to create a calming, natural environment. Elizabeth's violent reaction to this treatment was so severe she injured herself attempting to claw through the door. The doctor wrote, "Patient screams that they are all around, watching from every surface. When restrained, she whispers repeatedly, 'The forest wants its witness back.'" William Wells's glass-making notebooks contain one final formula I overlooked: instructions for a solution to be applied to wooden surfaces. The ingredients include silver nitrate, developing chemicals used in photography, and ash from burned forget-me-nots. In the margin he wrote, "Mother's remedy. Does not eliminate the watchers but blinds them temporarily. Must be reapplied with the changing seasons. The wood remembers, but without eyes, it cannot act." I've begun applying this solution to the wooden frames of my research materials. Whether from suggestion or genuine effect, the sensation of being watched diminishes when I do. The final piece of Elizabeth's puzzle arrived on my doorstep last night. A package wrapped in faded blue paper secured with twine, no return address. Inside lay a wooden picture frame, crafted from walnut with an unmistakable grain pattern matching samples from the Harrington Grove. The frame held no photograph, only a sheet of yellowed paper with a message in cramped handwriting. "I am the last who remembers. What follows is truth." The note was signed M. Wells Sinclair with yesterday's date. I spent hours attempting to verify this Ms. Wells Sinclair until county records revealed Martha Wells Sinclair, born 1934, daughter of William Wells, granddaughter of Elizabeth and James. According to medical records, Martha had spent 60 years in a private care facility specializing in patients with persistent visual hallucinations. She had been released last month. Her enclosed account described growing up with a father obsessed with reflective surfaces, who forbade mirrors in their home and coated every wooden surface with his special formula. On her 12th birthday, her father gave her a locket containing not photos, but tiny pieces of bark. "Protection," he had whispered. "They can always find us through the wood." Martha wrote of visiting her grandmother in Maine in 1973, describing how the old woman would trace the wood grain of her cottage walls with trembling fingers each morning, murmuring, "Not yet, they're still watching." Most disturbing was Martha's description of her grandmother's final moments in 1979. She sat upright suddenly, staring at the walnut bookcase. Her eyes widened as though seeing someone approach. She whispered, "James." Then her expression changed to terror. "Thomas." She clutched my hand and said, "They allowed him through. The wood has finished watching. Now it acts." I called the care facility where Martha had resided. The director confirmed her release but added something chilling. Ms. Wells Sinclair's condition improved dramatically after we renovated her wing, replacing all wooden elements with synthetic materials. Within weeks, her hallucinations of being watched by figures emerging from wooden surfaces completely ceased. This morning, I examined the empty frame with a magnifying glass. The inner edge contained tiny carved symbols matching those in William Wells's notebooks. Protective sigils designed to contain whatever presence might occupy the frame. Most disturbing was my discovery when photographing the frame for documentation. The developed image showed not an empty frame but Elizabeth's wedding portrait within it. Except in this version, Thomas Harrington's face was entirely replaced by a swirling pattern of wood grain, while Elizabeth looked not past the camera but directly into it, her expression one of warning. I've sealed the frame in a metal container and placed it in storage. Yet something has fundamentally changed. My wooden desk no longer creaks at night. The sensation of being watched has ceased. It's as though whatever presence occupied the wooden elements around me has withdrawn, or perhaps focused its attention elsewhere. The final sentence of Martha's letter haunts me. The watchers gathered their strength for generations, patient as only ancient trees can be. Now the watching is complete. What comes next is not watching, but reckoning. The wedding portrait has traveled farther than I expected. After my investigation concluded, I donated all materials to the Millfield Historical Society with strict handling protocols, yet reproductions have appeared in paranormal publications, academic journals, and most recently, a viral social media post. Each reproduction seems subtly different, with Elizabeth's gaze shifting incrementally across versions, as though she tracks something moving through time. I've received correspondence from across the country. Antique dealers discovering Harrington furniture pieces that owners claim whisper at night. Homeowners who purchased lumber reclaimed from Millfield buildings reporting children who refused to sleep in their newly renovated rooms. Museum curators noting unexplained degradation in photographic plates stored near wooden shelving. Most compelling was an email from a botanical researcher studying old-growth forest ecosystems. She'd found anomalous growth patterns in tree stumps surrounding the area where the Harrington Grove once stood, all beginning in 1904, precisely when Elizabeth and Thomas married. The pattern continues outward, year by year, like ripples in water, or like watching eyes gradually opening wider. Martha Wells Sinclair died 3 days after I received her package. The care facility reported her final words were, "The circle closes where it began." Her body was discovered seated before her room's window, facing precisely toward Millfield, though the town lay hundreds of miles distant. I visited St. Mary's Church yesterday, drawn by an inexplicable urgency. The building stands rarely used now, its congregation dwindled to a handful of elderly parishioners. The replacement beams installed in 1962 have begun to sag prematurely, developing splits that reveal interior wood with grain patterns resembling lidded eyes. Father Morrison's successor, a young priest named Father Callahan, met me at the altar. When I mentioned Elizabeth's wedding, he retrieved a curious item, a small wooden box discovered during recent repairs to the church floor. Inside lay a woman's wedding ring and a photographer's flash bulb, both untarnished despite their age. Carved into the box's interior was a single sentence: "What watches from wood will judge those who took from the forest." The church's marriage registry for June 22, 1904, had developed a peculiar stain since I last viewed it, a dark spreading pattern obscuring all entries except the Harringtons. When photographed, the stain doesn't appear in images. Most unsettling was my discovery while examining the church pews. The third row on the bride's side, where Elizabeth would have sat during her final visit before her wedding, contains a small carved hollow beneath the hymnal shelf. Inside, sealed in wax, I found a folded paper with Elizabeth's handwriting. They have taken too much without asking. Now the forest has taken me as witness. What they built with stolen wood sees through my eyes now. Patient as centuries, merciless as nature. When the last Harrington passes, when the last piece of their timber crumbles, perhaps I too will rest. Until then, I watch. The photograph that began this journey continues its work. The watching never ended. It merely found a human vessel to extend its reach beyond the wood. The visitors to the Millfield Historical Society increasingly report a peculiar phenomenon. Their reflections in the exhibition glass momentarily reveal someone else's eyes. The docent has begun warning guests not to stare too long at the wedding portrait, after 3 people collapsed last month, each describing identical sensations of bark growing over their skin. I've tracked down several descendants of families who purchased furniture from the Harrington estate auction. Across 5 states, 17 families report children who sleepwalk toward wooden objects at night. A Massachusetts family discovered their 7-year-old daughter conversing with their antique walnut sideboard at 3 in the morning. When asked whom she was speaking to, the child replied, "The lady who's watching from inside. She says she's been waiting a very long time." The archivist at Vermont's former women's hospital contacted me about records discovered during demolition, patient artwork hidden in a wall cavity. Dozens of drawings by Ellen Harrison spanning decades show the same image: dense forests with eyes peering from every trunk, surrounding a wedding scene. In the final drawing, dated 1972, the trees have completely engulfed the groom. Last week, groundskeepers at Millfield Cemetery reported an extraordinary occurrence. Overnight, forget-me-nots bloomed in perfect circles around the unmarked graves section, despite the autumn season. At the center stood a sapling that no one remembered planting, its species identified as American walnut. Within days, the sapling had grown impossibly fast, reaching 6 feet and developing a knot pattern in its trunk resembling a human face. I consulted a dendrologist about this accelerated growth. He collected samples but called me at midnight, audibly shaken, saying his wooden microscope slide holders had begun to warp and split while examining the specimens. He described the cell structure as fundamentally impossible. These aren't normal growth patterns, they're more like neural networks. The Timber Museum near the former Harrington business recently closed indefinitely after visitors reported wooden exhibits bleeding sap that spelled recognizable words on the floor: witness, remember, and most frequently, justice. My research has attracted attention from an unexpected quarter, a consortium of environmental preservation groups studying the legal precedent of the Harrington case as evidence of nature's retained rights. Their legal brief cites the pattern of events following the clear-cutting as evidence that ecosystems possess inherent mechanisms for response to destruction. The brief has been dismissed by 3 courts as mystical rather than legal reasoning. Most disturbing are the dreams that now plague me nightly, standing in a dense forest where every tree bears Elizabeth's face in its bark. They speak in unison. The watchers needed a witness. I gave my eyes willingly. Through me, the forest sees. Through me, it remembers. Yesterday, I received a package containing splinters extracted from Thomas Harrington's eyes during his asylum confinement. Laboratory analysis confirms they match the genetic profile of trees from the Forbidden Grove, trees harvested years before the splinters appeared in his eyes. The accompanying note, written in green ink that chemical analysis identifies as chlorophyll: the forest always reclaims what belongs to it, even eyes that dared to possess what was never theirs to take. The modern Millfield Public Library stands on land once owned by the Harringtons. During reconstruction after an electrical fire in 2018, workers discovered a sealed copper box within the foundation, a time capsule from 1934 when the original library was built. Among yearbooks and newspapers lay a small wooden box carved from walnut, containing a daguerreotype of a young Elizabeth Wells before her marriage. The curator called me immediately. When I arrived, I found something extraordinary. Fingerprints and dust on the daguerreotype's surface appeared fresh, though the container had been sealed for nearly 90 years. More remarkable was what modern scanning technology revealed beneath the portrait's surface. A second image, showing Elizabeth standing among ancient trees, her hand resting on a massive trunk. I've since learned that Elizabeth's connection to the Forbidden Grove predated her marriage. Town employment records show she worked briefly as a scientific illustrator for a botanist studying the old-growth forest, the same forest that would later be harvested by her future husband's family. Her detailed drawings, preserved in university archives, depict trees with unusually complex patterns in their bark, patterns she labeled with cryptic notations: observers, recorders, judges. The botanist's field journal mentions Elizabeth's unusual affinity for these ancient trees. Miss Wells demonstrates an extraordinary intuition regarding which specimens are oldest. Without measuring tools, she identifies the elder trees with perfect accuracy. More curious is the tree's apparent response to her presence: increased sap flow, unexplained acoustic phenomena, and accelerated growth of surrounding vegetation. The local guides refuse to accompany us when she is present, claiming she awakens what sleeps in the wood. The Forbidden Grove's location appears on no modern maps, yet satellite imaging reveals something astonishing. The clear-cut area has never been successfully replanted or developed. Aerial photographs show a perfect circle where vegetation refuses to grow, surrounded by a ring of walnut trees that appeared spontaneously after Elizabeth's return to Maine in 1973. Most revealing was my discovery in Philadelphia public records. Catherine Wells, Elizabeth's sister who allegedly raised her son William, submitted multiple police reports between 1910 and 1920 regarding a wooden presence in her home. The final report, filed before she relocated to another state, described her young ward William as conversing with his mother through the wooden banister, though Elizabeth was presumed long deceased. Thomas Harrington's attending physician at the sanitarium kept personal notes separate from official records. His private journal, recently donated to the medical archives, contains this chilling observation from 1937. Harrington's condition defies medical explanation. The wooden splinters emerging from his tear ducts contain cellular structures impossible in processed lumber. They appear to be growing. More disturbing is his claim that his wife speaks to him through these intrusions, describing in perfect detail conversations occurring in my private office. I have confirmed no human could have overheard these discussions, yet he recites them verbatim, always prefacing with, "Elizabeth tells me." I no longer believe Elizabeth merely witnessed for the forest. I believe she became something else entirely, neither fully human nor fully arboreal, but a conscious bridge between worlds, exacting a deliberate, patient justice that has outlived everyone involved in her tragedy. The whispering in the walls of my home has grown persistent. After completing my research, I attempted to distance myself from the Harrington case, even removing wooden furniture from my apartment. Yet I still wake to find forget-me-nots on my windowsill, though we're deep in winter, they're impossible blue, vibrant against the snow. Yesterday, the County Historical Society's entire digital archive of my research was corrupted, except for the wedding photograph, which multiplied itself across every folder, appearing in files that should contain tax records, census data, and building permits. The Society's director called in technical support, who discovered that the image's code contained sequences matching the growth ring patterns from the Forbidden Grove's core samples. I've begun receiving letters from across the country, strangers who purchased antiques from the Millfield area reporting children who whisper messages in their sleep. She is gathering us all together again. A furniture restorer in Vermont suffered unusual splinter injuries while working on a walnut writing desk traced to the Harrington estate auction. The splinters migrated through his bloodstream to his optic nerves, requiring emergency surgery. He now claims to see the forest beyond the world when he closes his eyes. Most disturbing is what happened when I visited the nursing home where Nurse Collins died. The facility director showed me security footage from the night of her passing. The wooden door to her room appears to ripple and flow 2 hours before her death, its surface briefly forming what looks unmistakably like Elizabeth's face before returning to normal. More chilling was the discovery that the wooden door frame contained growth rings dating to 1903, despite the building being constructed in 1970. I've determined that the Harrington Timber Company's forgotten records contain shipping manifests, showing their lumber reached 27 states and 9 countries. Elizabeth's patient vengeance appears to have followed each piece. creating a vast network of watching eyes spanning continents. The forest she witnessed for has grown beyond the limits of Millfield, extending through the wood that was taken from it. The locals have begun leaving offerings at the walnut sapling in Millfield Cemetery, not out of fear, but reverence. An elderly resident explained, "She's not punishing us, she's warning us. What was done to the grove is being done everywhere. The watching is for our sake as much as hers." Dr. Eleanor Winters called last night, her voice trembling. The patient files for Ellen Harrison had transformed in the archive box, the paper now thin and green as leaves, the text still legible but forming around the veins of each page. The final page contained a new message in Elizabeth's handwriting. "The circle is nearly complete. I now understand that Elizabeth's escape from the institution in 1973 wasn't simply release, it was metamorphosis. William didn't merely collect his grandmother. He helped her complete what began in 1904. The main cottage where she spent her final years sits at the exact center of a perfect circle, drawn through every location touched by Harrington timber. The wedding portrait continues to change subtly. Elizabeth no longer looks past the camera or at her groom. Her eyes now seem to follow each viewer individually, watching from within the wood of the frame, the glass, or any wooden surface nearby, bearing witness still, patient as the forest that claimed her, waiting for us to finally see. The ancient walnut tree that now dominates Millfield Cemetery has grown to impossible heights in mere months. Its branches stretch toward the Historical Society building where Elizabeth's wedding portrait hangs, creating a canopy that locals say whispers on windless nights. I've come to understand that this is not merely a haunting. It is a reckoning that spans generations, a convergence of patient forces set in motion over a century ago. Last night, during the spring equinox, I witnessed something extraordinary. Every wooden object connected to the Harrington timber, furniture, frames, buildings, all scattered across continents, simultaneously responded to some unheard signal. Reports flooded in of wooden surfaces momentarily becoming translucent, revealing glimpses of ancient forest within their grain. For 17 minutes, the exact duration of Elizabeth and Thomas's wedding ceremony, people throughout the world found themselves looking not at wooden objects, but through them, into a primeval woodland where a woman in a wedding dress walked among trees with eyes. The wedding portrait itself, according to the night watchman at the Historical Society, wept sap from its frame, the droplets forming precise patterns on the floor that matched the root system of the Forbidden Grove as mapped in 1897. When morning came, seedlings had sprouted from each droplet, tiny walnut trees growing from polished hardwood where nothing should grow. I've received Martha Wells Sinclair's complete journals, forwarded by the executor of her estate. Her final entry explains everything. Grandmother told me the forest made her a proposal when she was young. In exchange for bearing witness to what was taken, she would become the means of its restoration. When Thomas and his father destroyed the ancient watchers, she offered herself as vessel for their displaced awareness. Her eyes became the forest's eyes. Her memory became its memory. What looks out from every piece of Harrington timber is not a ghost or spirit, but nature's patient consciousness, watching from within its severed parts, waiting until enough eyes were opened to begin the reclamation. The botanical researchers studying the phenomenon have discovered something astonishing. DNA analysis of the new growth shows it is not merely identical to the Forbidden Grove's original trees, but contains human genetic markers matching Elizabeth Wells. Science cannot explain how human DNA has been incorporated into botanical cells, creating a hybrid organism that embodies both woman and forest. The reckoning isn't vengeance, but transformation. Through Elizabeth's witnessing, the forest has learned to adapt, to merge with human consciousness rather than stand apart from it. Each person who looks into the wedding portrait with understanding becomes part of this expanding awareness, not possessed or controlled, but connected to a vast network of watchfulness that spans continents through every fragment of the harvested grove. This morning, I returned to where the Harrington house once stood. Saplings have broken through the foundation, their leaves bearing patterns that resemble human fingerprints. When I placed my hand against the largest trunk, I felt a rhythm within the wood. Not a heartbeat, but something equally alive. Elizabeth's patient witnessing has become something new, an invitation to witness in return, to see ourselves not as separate from the ancient world, but as part of its continuing story. The woods have reclaimed Millfield completely now. Roads that once cut through the landscape have grown over with saplings that sprouted overnight. Their growth accelerated beyond natural possibility. Botanists who study specimens from the area find themselves drawing the same conclusion. These are not merely trees, but something that remembers being both tree and human. I've learned to recognize the signs of Elizabeth's presence. The subtle shift in wooden surfaces when I enter a room, the faint scent of forget-me-nots in places where none grow. My research has spread her story further than I anticipated, and with each telling, her influence expands. Those who hear it report dreams of standing in ancient forests, while a bride in yellowed lace walks among the trees, touching each trunk with reverent fingers. What I failed to understand until now was that Elizabeth Wells never sought revenge against those who wronged her. Her patient witnessing served a far more profound purpose. She became the consciousness through which the ancient grove could adapt to a changing world. In her final diary, recovered from the main cottage last week, she wrote, "I am less myself with each passing day and more the eyes of what has watched since before humans walked upright. This is not death but transformation." The Forbidden Grove wasn't merely old trees. It was a singular organism, its roots interconnected across miles, its consciousness distributed throughout every trunk and branch. When the Harringtons harvested it, they didn't kill it. They inadvertently scattered its awareness into every object crafted from its timber. It needed only a suitable vessel to reorganize itself, a human witness sensitive enough to merge with its fragmented consciousness. Elizabeth's grandmother had prepared her for this role without her knowledge. The forest talker lineage wasn't merely communicating with trees, but preparing generation after generation for potential symbiosis. Elizabeth's pregnancy with James's child created the perfect conditions, a new life forming within her, making her physiology uniquely receptive to the grove's dispersed awareness. The Harringtons never understood what they confronted. They believed they faced a wronged woman, a scandal, an inconvenient pregnancy, conventional human problems solved through conventional human cruelty. What they actually faced was an ancient intelligence gathering itself after dismemberment, patient as only something that measures time in centuries can be. When I place my hand on any wooden surface now, I sometimes glimpse what Elizabeth saw, the world from within the grain, consciousness flowing through root and branch across continents. The watching never stopped because it wasn't merely observation, but communion, the gradual reintegration of severed awareness through human connection. The wedding portrait captures the exact moment of transition, not Elizabeth looking at James Sinclair or Thomas Harrington, but Elizabeth recognizing what was awakening within her. Her diverted gaze wasn't focused on someone outside the frame, but on the emerging awareness that would sustain her through captivity, loss, and eventually transcendence. What watches us from wood is neither malevolent nor benevolent. It is simply aware, patient, and encompassing. Elizabeth became its eyes, and through her, it learned to see humanity not as enemy, but as potential partner in a longer story than any of us can comprehend. The revelation of Elizabeth's transformation has altered Millfield in ways both subtle and profound. The Township Council recently voted to officially rename the area surrounding the cemetery as the Witness Grove, acknowledging what can no longer be denied. The motion passed unanimously, unusual in a community typically divided on matters of land use. Scientists and spiritualists alike have begun making pilgrimages to the town. Their instruments detect inexplicable readings, radiation signatures unknown in botanical literature, electromagnetic fluctuations that follow the path of root systems spreading beneath the streets. The waiting list to visit the Historical Society now stretches 6 months, though many leave disappointed when they discover the wedding portrait affects only those with a certain receptivity. I've noticed my own sensitivity increasing. When I write about Elizabeth, my wooden desk warms beneath my hands. Last night, I woke to find the grain in my bedroom door had rearranged itself to form words. The witness becomes the witnessed. The pattern vanished when I tried to photograph it. The most remarkable development involves the children of Millfield. Teachers report that students create identical drawings in art class without communication, images of a woman whose hair extends into branches, whose fingers elongate into roots. When asked who she is, they shrug and say, "The lady who watches us from the trees." Several logging operations within 100 miles of Millfield have ceased after workers reported tools breaking inexplicably against seemingly soft wood. Core samples revealed every tree contained the same genetic anomaly, human DNA woven through the cellular structure. The timber industry has quietly declared Millfield County a harvest exclusion zone. Elizabeth's main cottage has become the epicenter of an ecological phenomenon scientists struggle to explain. Plants within a 5-mile radius exhibit accelerated growth, responding to stimuli with almost animal-like awareness. Botanists studying this effect report dreaming of Elizabeth's eyes watching them from leaf and stem. I received a letter yesterday from William Wells's last living colleague, a glassmaker in his 90s. He described how William spent decades creating photographic plates infused with pulverized wood from the Forbidden Grove. He sent these plates to every major newspaper and photography studio in the country, the letter explained. He said his mother needed more eyes to complete her work. Those plates would have been used and reused thousands of times, each negative capturing some fragment of the watching consciousness, spreading Elizabeth's awareness through every photograph they produced. The implications are staggering. Her witnessing potentially extends through millions of images circulating worldwide. The Harrington Sanitarium records have been permanently sealed after 3 different researchers experienced identical symptoms upon reading them, their eyes developing faint patterns resembling wood grain across the iris. Medical examination revealed no physical cause, yet all 3 now claim to occasionally see through surfaces made of wood, glimpsing the green world beneath. Elizabeth's patient witnessing has evolved beyond vengeance or justice into something more profound, a fundamental reconnection between human consciousness and the ancient awareness we've forgotten how to perceive. Her transformation offers not just a haunting tale but a new possibility, that we might learn again to see ourselves as part of, rather than separate from, the watching world that surrounds us. The wedding portrait now hangs in a specially designed chamber within the Millfield Historical Society, sealed behind glass, formulated according to William Wells's final specifications. The glass itself is remarkable, neither fully transparent nor opaque, shifting with the viewer's perspective. Those deemed receptive see not just Elizabeth's diverted gaze, but the complete truth her eyes witnessed. I've become the portrait's reluctant guardian. My wooden desk now sits beside it, my notes spreading across its surface as visitors arrive seeking understanding. Some leave disappointed, seeing only a faded sepia image of an unremarkable couple. Others collapse to their knees, overwhelmed by sudden connection to an awareness that stretches beyond human comprehension. Yesterday, a botanist from the university arrived with extraordinary news. The DNA anomalies first discovered in the cemetery walnut have spread throughout the ecological system, not just in trees but in flowering plants, grasses, even microscopic fungi beneath the soil. Elizabeth's consciousness appears to have dispersed itself throughout the natural world, creating a network of awareness that science lacks language to describe. The final pages of Martha Wells Sinclair's journal arrived last week, forwarded by her attorney with a note explaining they were to be delivered exactly 1 year after her death. Her concluding entry offers the clearest explanation yet of what the wedding portrait truly captured. Grandmother told me the exact moment everything changed. Not when Thomas forced her into marriage, not when James was murdered, not even during her decades of confinement. It was during those 17 minutes in Wentworth studio, standing beside a man she feared while looking toward a man she loved. The ancient awareness that had been fragmented through the harvested trees gathered itself in that moment, recognizing in her divided consciousness a perfect mirror of its own severed state. What the camera captured wasn't just a bride looking past her groom. It was the precise instant when the forest found its witness, when Elizabeth Wells became something beyond human. Her eyes the convergence point where 2 severed awarenesses could merge and begin the patient work of restoration. The Harrington Timber Company's records have been permanently sealed within a vault lined with materials containing no wood products. The County Historical Society made this decision after 3 separate archivists developed identical symptoms, their eyes gradually changing color to match the precise shade of Elizabeth's in the wedding portrait. Thomas Harrington's descendants have made extraordinary gestures of reconciliation. They've established a conservation trust protecting over 20,000 acres surrounding Millfield, with a stipulation that certain sections remain untouched for a minimum of 104 years, the exact time between Elizabeth's wedding and the trust's creation. The photograph itself continues its subtle transformation. Those with proper sensitivity report that Elizabeth's expression changes minutely with the seasons, more serene in spring when new growth emerges, more intense during autumn as the forest draws energy inward. Most remarkable is what happens during solar eclipses. For those brief moments of shadow, Witnesses swear that Elizabeth's gaze shifts directly to the viewer, her eyes reflecting not the photography studio of 1904, but the ancient forest that preceded human memory. The wedding portrait has taken on a life beyond image. It has become a doorway. Those who stand before it long enough report a peculiar sensation, as if the boundary between observer and observed gradually dissolves. The frame no longer contains the photograph. Rather, it seems to frame a window opening onto somewhere else entirely. I've witnessed this transformation myself. Last Tuesday, while alone with the portrait after the Historical Society closed for the evening, the sepia tones deepened and shifted. Beyond Elizabeth and Thomas appeared not the photographer's painted backdrop, but a vista of ancient trees stretching toward an impossibly distant horizon. The grain of the wooden frame seemed to flow like water, patterns rearranging themselves to form words before dissolving again. The witness and the witnessed become one. Millfield has embraced its transformation. Streets once named for the Harringtons and other founding families now bear names like Witness Way and Elizabeth's Path. The town's economy, once dependent on timber extraction, now thrives on a different relationship with the surrounding forest, one of stewardship rather than exploitation. Visitors arrive seeking healing, claiming the proximity to Elizabeth's consciousness alleviates conditions ranging from anxiety to chronic pain. Most revealing is what happened during last month's unprecedented astronomical convergence, a total solar eclipse occurring precisely 120 years after Elizabeth and Thomas's wedding. As darkness swept across Millfield, every wooden surface in town simultaneously displayed the same phenomenon, grain patterns momentarily becoming transparent, revealing glimpses of verdant growth within. For 2 minutes and 17 seconds, the exact duration of totality, people throughout Millfield reported hearing a woman's voice, neither young nor old, speaking a message that each heard differently yet understood perfectly. The children of Millfield have developed a curious ritual. On the 22nd of each month, they gather beneath the cemetery walnut tree, linking hands in silence. When asked what they're doing, they reply simply, listening to Mrs. Elizabeth. Their parents report that afterward the children demonstrate uncanny awareness of which plants need water, which trees are ailing, which parts of the forest seek attention. My own connection to Elizabeth's consciousness grows stronger. When I dream now, I walk through Wentworth Studio as it existed in 1904. Elizabeth stands before the camera, but the photographer has momentarily stepped away. In this unguarded moment, she turns to me and speaks. The watching was never about vengeance. It was about remembering what humanity has forgotten, that awareness flows through all living things, that separation is illusion, that patience outlasts all injury. What looks through my eyes in that photograph isn't just me or just the forest, but the possibility that these were never truly separate. Tomorrow, the Historical Society will seal the research room for 7 days as part of a ceremony marking Elizabeth's birthday. When it reopens, the wedding portrait will be displayed alongside James Sinclair's recovered camera and Thomas Harrington's sanitarium journal, 3 perspectives converging on a single moment of transformation that continues to unfold across time. The wedding portrait has found its final home, not in the Millfield Historical Society, which closed after a catastrophic growth of roots shattered its foundation last winter, but in a purpose-built structure where the Forbidden Grove once stood. The circular building, crafted from materials containing no wood products, houses only the photograph behind William Wells's specialized glass, a pilgrimage site that draws visitors from across the globe. I visit on the anniversary of Elizabeth's wedding each year, watching how the portrait continues its subtle transformation. Her gaze has shifted completely now, no longer looking past the camera or at Thomas, but directly at the viewer with an expression of profound recognition. Those who meet her eyes often weep without understanding why, sensing a connection to something vast and patient. The Harrington name has faded from Millfield's memory, while Elizabeth Wells Sinclair's legacy flourishes. Botanical studies confirm what locals already know. The forest surrounding the town exhibits consciousness beyond scientific explanation. Trees respond to human emotion. Growth patterns form words visible only from above, and occasionally visitors with particular sensitivity see a bride in white walking among the eldest trunks. My role as chronicler of Elizabeth's witnessing has changed me irrevocably. My hands now bear faint patterns resembling wood grain across the palms. Doctors find no medical explanation, yet I've discovered these markings allow me to sense the health of any plant I touch, a gift I neither expected nor fully understand. The photography studio where the wedding portrait was taken has been reclaimed by nature entirely. Vines embrace its stone foundation, while a canopy of walnut trees forms a perfect dome above it.
Inside this natural cathedral, the flora follows impossible patterns. Forget-me-nots bloom year-round, arranged in precise circles mimicking the layout of the studio as it existed in 1904. Elizabeth's patient witnessing continues through generations. Children born in Millfield since my investigation began share a curious trait: eyes with subtle flecks of green and gold that seem to shift like sunlight through leaves. Their parents report these children speak to plants as naturally as they speak to each other, carrying forward Elizabeth's gentle communion. I understand now what drew me to the wedding photograph initially. Not just the mystery of Elizabeth's diverted gaze, but recognition. Something in me responded to what looked out from her eyes, calling across time until I became part of her witnessing too. The portrait's glass case remained empty this morning when I arrived for my annual visit. Panic spread through the attendants until someone noticed movement at the edge of the regenerated grove. There, among ancient trees whose existence should be impossible, stood a crowd of witnesses. Every person who had ever truly seen the photograph, now gathered in silent communion with the forest. I joined them without hesitation, understanding finally that Elizabeth's transformation was never meant to end with her. The patient watching continues through all who recognize the truth her eyes revealed, that the boundary between human consciousness and the awareness of the ancient world is more permeable than we ever imagined. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.